Wicked was supposed to be Oz's big comeback, the musical event of the decade, with Ariana Grande, a lineup of unforgettable songs, and the promise of bringing back that old movie magic we all grew up with. But what started as a dream quickly turned into a nightmare, because the story of Oz has always carried a dark side. The original lead actress had to be on medication just to keep singing. Actors ended up in the hospital after almost every scene, and the set felt more like a trap than a studio. The 1939 classic looked beautiful on screen, but behind the curtain, it was pure chaos. But the curse doesn't stop there. While Wicked was being filmed, that same shadow haunting Hollywood's most famous witches came back for a new generation. What was meant to be the most anticipated movie of the year turned into a swirl of scandals, burnout, and drama, both on and off the set. So get ready, because today we're diving into one of Hollywood's most dangerous spells. And if Oz taught us anything, it's that fame always comes with a price, even for fairy tales. Released in 2024, Wicked was a massive production that ended up tangled in controversy. But to understand why, we need to go way back. This story didn't begin with Ariana Grande or modern CGI. It began with a man who set out to create the ultimate fairy tale and accidentally opened the door to one of Hollywood's darkest legends. Let's rewind more than 160 years. Born in New York in 1856, Lyman Frank Baum was an American writer best known for his children's fantasy novels. He grew up on a family estate called Rose Lawn, a place he always remembered as paradise. Baum was a sickly kid with an overactive imagination. At 12, he was sent to a military academy where strict discipline clashed with his creative spirit. He was constantly punished for daydreaming until the stress caused a physical breakdown. Not long after, he was expelled. That experience left a deep mark on him and, in its own way, shaped the kind of stories he would tell for the rest of his life. From a young age, Baum started writing on his own, using a small printing press his father had bought secondhand. Together with his brother Henry, he created the Rose Lawn Home Journal, a homemade paper filled with stories and updates about life on the family estate. By his early 20s, Baum had become obsessed with theater. He jumped into the stage world, but in the worst way possible. A struggling company hired him to fix their costumes, promising starring roles if he managed to pull it off. It turned out to be a complete scam. Disillusioned, he took a job at his brother-in-law's store, and that's where something happened that would stay with him forever. One morning, Baum discovered a coworker locked inside a storage room under circumstances no one could fully explain, and it later became the seed for his first published short story. For most people, that kind of moment would have been deeply traumatic. For Baum, it became fuel for his imagination. That strange mix of wonder and tragedy would follow him for the rest of his life. In 1882, he married Maud Gage and moved to Aberdeen in what was then Dakota Territory, where a much darker side of him emerged as editor of the local newspaper, the Aberdeen Saturday Pioneer. After the death of native leader Sitting Bull, Baum wrote a column on December 20, 1890, suggesting that the government should eliminate the remaining indigenous tribes from the region. Some believed he was being ironic, but that idea quickly faded a year later when he published another editorial responding to what happened at Wounded Knee, where hundreds of native men, women, and children were killed by the U.S. Army. In that piece, Baum went even further. He wrote, "We better, for the sake of our civilization, remove these untamable creatures from the face of the earth." If that shocks you, it makes sense. It's hard to imagine that the same man who created one of the most colorful and cheerful fantasy worlds could also express views that extreme. But like everything in Oz, contrasts were everywhere. After his newspaper collapsed in 1891, Baum had to start over. He moved to Chicago with his wife and 4 children, and spent almost a decade writing children's poems and fantasy tales. Then in 1900, he finally found his turning point. Together with illustrator William Denslow, he published The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and that book changed everything. It was an instant success. Kids adored it, critics praised it, and for 2 straight years, it became the best-selling children's book in America. Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion became symbols of courage, imagination, and hope. Baum had invented a completely new kind of fairy tale, one without kings or European castles, crafted instead around the American dream itself. 2 years after the first book, Baum and Denslow adapted the story for the stage in a musical directed by Fred Hamlin. The problem was, Baum didn't know when to stop. His obsession with theater led him to invest in increasingly ambitious productions until by 1911 he was bankrupt. He sold the rights to several of his works, including The Wizard of Oz, and was forced to let go of his dream of a grand stage career. In the years that followed, a handful of early film versions of Oz appeared, but none of them left a mark. 1919. Drained and out of money, L. Frank Baum suffered a stroke. He died the next day, just 9 days before his 63rd birthday. According to his wife, his final words were, "Now I can go to sleep." A simple line, yet almost prophetic, since 20 years later, his creation would awaken again. In 1939, The Wizard of Oz was reborn on the big screen. The film became a timeless classic, but it also came with a string of accidents and tragedies that would fuel rumors of a curse. And maybe that makes sense. Baum had created Oz as an escape from his own darkness, a world where lost souls could finally find their way home, a place so full of light it was destined to cast shadows. By the late 1930s, Hollywood was in the middle of a revolution. Sound was part of the language, color was taking over, and major studios were racing to create the most spectacular fantasy ever made. In the middle of that competition, a producer named Mervyn LeRoy set himself an impossible goal: to bring Oz back to life. LeRoy wasn't just another dreamer. He had already found success with I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang and 42nd Street, earning a reputation as one of MGM's most ambitious producers. But this time, he wanted something else. Something that felt truly magical. A film that could rival the phenomenon Walt Disney had just created with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But that wouldn't be easy. Snow White had everything: princesses, castles, enchanted forests, and singing animals. The Wizard of Oz, on the other hand, was a different kind of story. It was purely American. No royalty, no fairy tale kingdoms, just a farm girl who ended up in a place that felt like it came straight out of a fever dream. Convincing MGM's executives wasn't easy. Adapting a book that had already failed multiple times sounded like a risk no one wanted to take, but LeRoy wouldn't back down. He pushed the idea with the same conviction Baum had shown 40 years earlier. Eventually, the studio agreed. In 1938, MGM bought the rights to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and LeRoy took charge of a production meant to be the most ambitious Technicolor project ever made. What no one realized was that behind that bright, dreamlike vision, a storm was already forming, one that would turn The Wizard of Oz into one of the most troubled productions in Hollywood history. With the project finally approved, Mervyn LeRoy had one mission left: finding the perfect Dorothy Gale. At the time, the most famous child in the world was Shirley Temple, only 10 years old and already the biggest star at 20th Century Fox. Her name alone could guarantee a hit. LeRoy tried to make a deal with Fox, but the negotiations fell apart. Some said Shirley's voice couldn't handle the songs. Others claimed the studio simply refused to give up their top star. So LeRoy turned to someone already working at MGM: Judy Garland. She was 16 with a remarkable voice and a quiet vulnerability that drew people in. But she wasn't what the studio had pictured for Dorothy. She wasn't a little girl. Still, LeRoy pushed for her. He saw something real in Judy, an honesty that could carry the entire story. Once MGM approved the choice, the real transformation began. By taking the role, Judy unknowingly sealed her fate. From day one, she was put on a strict diet, made to wear a corset that minimized her figure, and placed under constant supervision. She was given pills to stay awake through long rehearsals, and others to help her sleep when she no longer could. Before ever arriving in Oz, Judy was already trapped inside the dream factory. She became the heart of the film, and its first victim. LeRoy now faced a new challenge. Who could possibly direct something like this? Names floated around: Norman Taurog, George Cukor, Victor Fleming. All were considered, but in the end, the studio chose Richard Thropp. Fast, efficient, and known for delivering results without asking too many questions. Exactly the kind of director MGM called when they needed things done. But this time, those same traits would be his undoing. We'll get to that soon. With his lead secured, both in front of and behind the camera, LeRoy turned to filling out the rest of the cast. Ray Bolger, a charismatic and flexible dancer, was the first to sign on. At first, he was cast as the Tin Man, but he asked to switch roles, convinced the Scarecrow fit him better. The studio agreed, and the metallic part went to Buddy Ebsen, an actor seemingly made for musicals. For the Cowardly Lion, they chose comedian Bert Lahr, a beloved Broadway performer. And to complete the lineup, the Wicked Witch of the West went to Margaret Hamilton, a former schoolteacher and single mother who could command every scene she was in. The cast was ready. Judy would be the heart, Bolger the soul, Ebsen the sacrifice, Lahr the humor, Hamilton the fear, and together, without knowing it, they were about to become part of something much bigger and far darker than anyone could imagine. The dream was ready to begin. MGM was certain it was about to make history. And in a way, it was. But the story that would endure wasn't the one on screen. It was the price Hollywood paid for turning dreams into reality. If you still doubt this project carried its creator's curse, just wait. The worst was yet to come. From the start, The Wizard of Oz began falling apart from within. The first crack appeared at the top. Richard Thorpe, the director Mervyn LeRoy had chosen to lead the film, began production with his usual efficiency. But his mechanical approach and lack of visual sensitivity clashed with everything MGM had envisioned. The early footage felt lifeless. Dorothy wore a blonde wig, the makeup was heavy, and the story had no spark. When LeRoy saw the material, he knew something was wrong. 2 weeks after filming began, Thorpe was gone. The studio then turned to George Cukor, a veteran known for his skill with actors and his sharp eye for detail. But Cukor wasn't hired to direct. He was hired to fix what was broken. He reinvented Dorothy. He ditched the wig, softened the makeup, and gave her the natural look we all know today. He also helped Judy reconnect with her character, to feel like a real girl again, in the middle of so much artifice. Cukor never filmed a full scene. After only a few days, MGM reassigned him to another project. Then came Victor Fleming, a man known for his toughness. His presence was commanding, his style direct, and his temper legendary. He was the one who finally got the production moving again. But the cost of that success would be far greater than anyone had imagined. To understand just how many questionable choices were made during the making of The Wizard of Oz, we need a bit of context. When production began, Hollywood was in the middle of its golden age. But behind all the glamour, the studio system was brutal. Contracts mattered more than people, and an actor's health was seen as a minor issue if it stood in the way of a movie. MGM wanted every character to look like they'd stepped out of a dream. But what the costume and makeup departments created looked more like a nightmare. There were so many things that, by today's standards, would be unthinkable, it would take an hour to list them. So let's start with one. The Tin Man's skin needed to shine under Technicolor. To make that happen, the crew covered actor Buddy Ebsen with a mix of aluminum powder and cosmetic grease. Within days, he began coughing, then gasping for air. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered the aluminum dust had entered his lungs. Ebsen spent weeks in recovery, while the studio, without even telling him, had already started looking for his replacement. Jack Haley took over the role, but the makeup team's fix wasn't much better. They replaced the aluminum powder with liquid paint, just as toxic, that caused a painful eye infection. The Cowardly Lion didn't have it any easier. Bert Lahr's costume was made from real lion skin, weighed nearly 90 pounds, and trapped heat like an oven under the studio lights. Lahr had to sing, act, and move inside what was basically a sauna, with air so heavy he could barely breathe. By the end of each day, the drenched costume had to be dried with industrial fans, so it could be used again the next morning. At first, the Scarecrow, played by Ray Bolger, seemed to have it easier, but his makeup hardened on his skin throughout the day, sticking so tightly that removing it left deep marks and cuts that took weeks to heal. For years, Bolger claimed the lines from his mask had literally stayed engraved on his face. And then there was the Wicked Witch of the West. Margaret Hamilton's green makeup was made from a chemical mix that could ignite when exposed to heat. And of course, that's exactly what happened. During one scene, a fire effect triggered too early. Hamilton managed to cover her face just in time, but the flames caught her hand and chin. She suffered second-degree burns and spent weeks in the hospital. When she returned, she agreed to continue only under one condition: no fire anywhere near her again. On screen, the movie looked like pure magic, bright, colorful, and full of wonder. But behind the scenes, it was closer to a torture chamber. Technicians experimented without understanding the risks. Makeup artists handled toxic materials, like regular paint, and no one, absolutely no one, questioned whether it was worth it. Because in Hollywood, in 1939, pain was just part of the job. Still, the makeup and costume teams weren't the only ones pushing things too far. Victor Fleming fit perfectly into that system. He drove his actors to exhaustion, demanding take after take until he got the result he wanted. Under his direction, the atmosphere on set became unbearable. The heat from the Technicolor lights, the heavy makeup, and the endless days caused the cast to faint, collapse, or fall ill more than once. While the rest of the cast suffered on the outside, Judy Garland was breaking on the inside. She didn't need a costume to feel trapped. Her prison was invisible, and it was called MGM. From her first day on set, the studio treated her like a product. She was forced to wear a tight corset and kept on a diet of chicken soup and cigarettes. Yes, that's real. Barely enough to keep her standing. Her body was monitored, her voice controlled, and her smile rehearsed. For Judy, the real nightmare began once the cameras stopped rolling. To endure the marathon days, often stretching past 16 hours, producers and studio doctors gave her pills to stay awake, and others to sleep once they finally let her rest. Judy lived between chemical highs and total exhaustion, a cycle that, at the time, was seen as part of the job, but one that would slowly destroy her. Her relationships with the adults around her were just as toxic. Her mother, Ethel Gum, wasn't a source of comfort. She was on set watching every move, pushing her to satisfy the studio. Things weren't much better with her co-stars. Many resented the attention MGM gave her. Haley, Bolger, and Lahr often took it out on her through cruel pranks. No one defended her. During one scene, it went even further. She was slapped across the face in the middle of a take. Again, just wait, we'll get to that soon. Despite the exhaustion, the pain, and the 80 cigarettes she was told to smoke each day to stay thin, something changed whenever the camera started rolling. Judy disappeared, and Dorothy came to life. She sang with such pure innocence that audiences believed there was real hope behind that voice. For Judy, Over the Rainbow became her sanctuary, the one moment on set where she could feel free, even if only for a few minutes. But once the cameras stopped, she returned to the same routine: hunger, pressure, and exhaustion. As we've mentioned, Victor Fleming was a demanding director with a volatile temper, especially with Judy. During the scene where Dorothy had to slap the cowardly lion, she couldn't stop laughing. The tension kept building until the crew had to call a break. Fleming, furious, grabbed her by the arm, pulled her aside, and gave her a talk, one that ended with a real slap. She came back, eyes full of tears, and finished the scene in a single take. A few minutes later, Fleming regretted it. He told a colleague he wished someone would break his nose for losing control. Judy overheard him and, in a gesture as tender as it was heartbreaking, walked over and kissed him on the nose, her way of forgiving him. That was how she survived, by forgiving fast and going back to work. But the worst didn't come from Fleming. It came from above. MGM's head, Louis B. Mayer, had a disturbing way of praising Judy's talent. He often said she sang from the heart, while resting his hand on her, claiming he wanted to feel where her heart was. Years later, in her unfinished memoirs, Judy would write with dark irony that she was lucky she didn't sing from another part of her body. As if the production weren't chaotic enough, near the end of filming, Fleming was suddenly pulled from Oz to replace George Cukor on another massive project, Gone with the Wind. Once again, the set was left without a director. To finish the movie, MGM brought in a fourth, King Vidor, whose main goal was simply to wrap the film without anyone else collapsing, getting hurt, or ending up hospitalized. When the cameras finally stopped, no one on the Wizard of Oz set could believe it was truly over. They had survived fires, poisonings, fainting spells, director changes, accidents, endless workdays, and nervous breakdowns. For those who lived through it, The Wizard of Oz was never just a movie, it was a scar. The premiere took place in 1939. The world was inching toward war, and America was desperate for a story that could remind it of something pure, something hopeful. On the night of the premiere, the lights of Grauman's Chinese Theater lit up the sky over Los Angeles. The orchestra began playing Over the Rainbow, and for a couple of hours, the audience forgot the world outside. That night, Hollywood proved it could still create dreams in full color, even if it had broken the people who made them. Critics fell in love with it. The Technicolor looked like magic. The songs became instant anthems, and audiences walked out of theaters, certain they'd seen something truly special. But while the world was falling in love with Dorothy and her friends, the people behind them were already falling apart. Judy Garland, the girl who'd stolen the world's heart as Dorothy, ended up belonging to MGM. The studio made her its brightest star, and its most obedient prisoner. By 17, she was already hooked on By 20, she was trapped in a system that made her smile on camera while she fell apart behind it. Her weight was monitored daily, while her mental health was ignored. With every movie, she drifted further away from the girl who once dreamed of finding her way home, until there was nothing left to find. The years that followed were a blur of relapses, hospitals, and broken marriages. Her voice kept her alive, but her body couldn't keep up with an industry built to chew up its stars. In 1969, 30 years after The Wizard of Oz, Judy was found in her London apartment. She was 47. The little girl who once sang about what waited beyond the rainbow never found anything on the other side. And she wasn't the only one who paid the price. Buddy Ebsen lived with lung problems for the rest of his life. Margaret Hamilton never felt safe on a set again after the fire that almost left her son without a mother. Bert Lahr, the Cowardly Lion, was remembered not for the laughter he brought to Oz, but for the months he spent sweating and gasping inside a costume made from real lion skin. Each of them carried their own scars, like Oz had touched them once and never let them go. Back then, the pain of the people behind the curtain was the last thing Hollywood, or the audience, cared about. Over the years, The Wizard of Oz became untouchable. It aired on TV every year, and generations of kids grew up believing that World of Color was the very definition of happiness. No one talked about the pain behind every frame, or the trail of broken talent Hollywood left behind. And yet, something about that story still feels alive. Like the spirit of Oz never really stopped turning, always searching for new victims, new generations willing to bring it back. Now, more than 80 years later, the cycle has started again. A new version of The Wizard of Oz had returned to theaters, powered by technology Frank Baum could have never imagined, but carrying the same promise, to take us back to that magical world we think we know so well. Maybe the curse never ended, maybe it was just waiting for its turn to return. And yet, something about that story still feels alive. For decades, The Wizard of Oz was untouchable, a sacred classic that Hollywood kept locked away, afraid to stir the ghosts of its troubled past. But then, almost 50 years later, someone finally dared to return. In 1995, American author Gregory Maguire stepped back into Oz, a world everyone thought had been buried long ago. But he didn't go there to celebrate it. He went to question it. His novel, Wicked: The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West, wasn't a sequel or a remake. It was a moral autopsy of Oz itself. Maguire asked the question no one had dared to ask in 60 years. What if the witch wasn't truly evil? What if the real monster of Oz wasn't her, but the way we chose to tell her story? He built a darker, more complicated version of that world, one shaped by politics, power, and prejudice. And at its center was Elphaba, not a cartoon villain painted green, but a woman scarred by rejection, fear, and corruption. Someone who became the monster the world needed her to be. When Gregory Maguire began writing Wicked in the early 90s, he knew he was stepping on sacred ground. The Wizard of Oz wasn't just a cultural landmark, it was a corporate fortress, guarded by lawyers, heirs, and studios that owned every corner of that world. The rights to L. Frank Baum's original novel were already in the public domain in the US, which technically gave Maguire room to reinterpret it. But everything created for the 1939 film, the costumes, the dialogue, even the exact shade of Emerald City, still belonged to MGM. And that made things complicated. In Baum's books, she was described as terribly ugly, with one eye and skin with a greenish tint. But the bright, unforgettable green that everyone associated with her came from the movie. Maguire played with that gray area. He never mentioned a specific MGM green, and he carefully avoided any description or visual cue that could be traced back to the film. Maguire had to rebuild Oz from the ground up, renaming places, changing characters, and rewriting descriptions to stay clear of legal trouble. If he got too close to the movie, he risked being sued. If he strayed too far, he'd lose the magic that made Oz what it was. With that challenge hanging over him, he created a new version of the story, one that was darker, more complex, and deeply sad. It flipped the morals of the original upside down, and in the process, brought back the spirit of L. Frank Baum himself. Contradictions included. Maguire sent the manuscript to one publisher after another. Most rejected it, calling it too dark or impossible to sell. Eventually, Reagan Books decided to take the risk, convinced that adults who'd grown up with The Wizard of Oz might be ready to see it from a different perspective. When Wicked finally hit the shelves, it became an unexpected success. But one thing was clear, Oz would never be the same again. It had come back to life, and like every time Oz returns, something dark seemed to return with it. With Oz, it always happens the same way. The moment it starts to shine again, someone tries to claim its light. It's as if Baum's world were a rare pearl, something sacred that shouldn't be touched. But every time someone does, something dark wakes up. Gregory Maguire's novel had already brought that world back to life with a more adult point of view. But its success reignited something that had been quiet for decades, the urge to sing in Oz again. In 1998, composer Stephen Schwartz, already known for Godspell, Pippin, and the songs from The Prince of Egypt, stumbled upon Wicked while on vacation in Hawaii. He read it in one sitting, and when he finished, he knew he'd just found his next obsession. Schwartz saw Wicked as more than a fantasy. It was a story about power, morality, and friendship, set in a world ruled by corruption. The problem was, he didn't own the rights, and Maguire wasn't eager to give them up. After years of fighting to keep his story out of corporate hands, Maguire had no intention of letting Oz become another product of the same system that had destroyed Judy Garland half a century earlier. But Schwartz refused to give up. He wrote to Maguire and told him his vision was different, that he didn't want to soften the story, but that he wanted to honor its darkness. Eventually, Maguire said yes, but he gave him one warning. Be careful. No one returns to Oz without consequences. With the rights finally secured, Stephen Schwartz teamed up with writer Winnie Holzman, best known for My So-Called Life, to bring Wicked to the stage. Together with producer Mark Platt, they began a 5-year journey filled with songs, rewrites, rehearsals, creative clashes, and moments of near collapse. The show grew into something wild, too big, too expensive, too unpredictable. The first previews in San Francisco were a technical mess. Platforms jammed, flying effects failed, and the green makeup used for Elphaba caused allergic reactions in some of the actresses. Nothing seemed to go right. Someone on the crew joked, "It's like Oz doesn't want to be told again." And in a way, they were right. Still, Schwartz refused to give up. He believed that if he could make audiences understand and love the witch, Wicked could change the darkness of Oz forever. And he did. Idina Menzel and Kristen Chenoweth stepped onto the stage as Elphaba and Glinda, and once again the world surrendered to Oz. Only this time the story didn't end with a house falling from the sky. It ended with a woman learning to fly. But in Oz, as always, flying comes with a price. It didn't take long for Wicked to catch Hollywood's attention. It was the early 2000s and studios were hunting for old myths to bring back to life. Gregory Maguire's twisted take on Oz had become an unexpected hit, and suddenly everyone wanted in. In the middle of that frenzy, one of the biggest stars of the era decided to make her move: Demi Moore. After the success of Ghost and Indecent Proposal, Moore was ready for something bigger, to produce her own major film. Together with her partner Suzanne Todd and screenwriter Linda Woolverton, she began developing a dark, dramatic adaptation of Wicked under their new independent company, Moving Pictures. It was a risky move, a project without the backing of any major studio. Moore and Todd didn't want a musical. They wanted a grounded, mature version of Oz, stripped of the spectacle, full of shadows and consequence. For Maguire, that was the only kind of adaptation that made sense. He'd spent years protecting his story from the same corporate machine that had destroyed Judy Garland half a century earlier. So he agreed to sell the rights almost immediately, thrilled by the idea of seeing the real Oz on the big screen. Maybe he didn't realize, or maybe he chose not to, what happened every time someone tried to bring Oz back. Even though Demi Moore seemed sure of her vision, there were still plenty of superstitious minds left in Hollywood. Veterans who'd seen too much, producers who whispered about the curse of Oz, the accidents, the strange coincidences, the tragedies that haunted anyone who dared to bring that world back. Some even swore Wicked was doomed from the moment the contract was signed. But let's be honest, this is Hollywood. Curses make great stories, but what really matters here is money. And if everything went right, this one could be the next goldmine. For months, Moore, Todd, and Woolverton worked quietly, trying to craft something that stayed true to the spirit of Maguire's book. But in Los Angeles, secrets didn't last long. Word got out that someone was trying to bring Oz back, and soon the rumor spread through agents, executives, and studio boardrooms. It didn't take long for that whisper to reach the one place powerful enough to make it happen: Universal Pictures. The head of Universal's film division, Joseph M. Singer, asked to see the material. The moment he read it, he was hooked. He saw potential, scale, marketing power, and a title with serious history behind it. Singer met personally with Demi Moore and Suzanne Todd to make them an offer. Universal would buy the adaptation rights from their company for $1 million, with both of them staying attached as executive producers. Just like that, the project stopped being an indie gamble and became the property of a studio giant. Moore's team agreed, and within weeks, Wicked changed completely. Gregory Maguire no longer had any control. What began as a personal vision was now a full-scale studio project under Universal. Linda Woolverton was officially hired to write the screenplay, and the studio began searching for a director brave enough to face the impossible, stepping into the shadow of the Wizard of Oz. After Universal stepped in, everything looked like it was finally on track. A major studio, a script in development, Demi Moore protecting the project. And Wicked had all the signs of becoming one of the big cinematic events of the new century. But in Hollywood, the projects that seemed too promising were usually the first ones to crumble. The search for a director turned into a disaster. The top choice was Robert Zemeckis, the filmmaker behind Back to the Future and Forrest Gump. He loved the idea of building a massive digital reimagining of Oz, but he couldn't nail the tone. Zemeckis wanted something sweeping and spectacular, while Linda Woolverton's script was quieter, political, and a lot darker. He walked away, and with him, the first real chance at making Wicked simply evaporated. What followed was years of pure limbo, the kind of situation Hollywood politely calls development hell. Scripts rewritten over and over, directors attached and then gone, studios acting like the project was still alive, even when everyone knew it wasn't. There were attempts to bring it back in 2009, 2012, and 2017, each time with fresh producers, new scripts, and another lineup of directors. Ryan Murphy, J.J. Abrams, James Mangold, even Stephen Daldry, who stayed on board for years, eventually stepped away. Everyone left for the same reason. Wicked felt impossible to adapt without breaking something fundamental. Too dark, too expensive, too big, and maybe for some a little too cursed. As executives kept debating budgets and new drafts, time just kept slipping away. Years turned into decades, and even the original trio from Moving Pictures began to sync with the project. Studio notes kept piling up. Rewrite this, soften that, add more wonder, tone down the politics. In short, they wanted to strip Wicked of everything Moore, Todd, and Woolverton had fought to protect. And little by little, they succeeded. Demi Moore was the first to let go. Her company never took off, and her career hit a chaotic stretch. She went from one of Hollywood's biggest stars to a tabloid target, talked about more for her private life than her work. Suzanne Todd tried to stay in the mix, but her momentum faded. And after years of studio notes and abandoned drafts, Linda Woolverton finally walked away, exhausted. 20 years later, all three women were on completely different paths, but they had one thing in common. They'd touched Oz, and nothing in their lives was quite the same afterward. Once again, the curse had quietly done its work. It wasn't until 2021, after countless failed attempts, that Universal finally managed to bring the project back to life. The studio chose Jon M, known for Crazy Rich Asians and In the Heights. Young, energetic, and genuinely obsessed with musicals, he seemed like the perfect person to finish what everyone else had abandoned. But without realizing it, Chu walked straight into the lion's den, and in the process, he brought back a world that had spent half a century trying not to return. If you've been around this channel long enough, you know the pattern. The more ambitious a project is, the more likely it is to spiral out of control. So when Universal announced that Wicked would be split into 2 films, both shot at the same time, Hollywood reacted fast. Some praised the ambition. Others quietly wondered if the studio had just signed up for a disaster. Historically, every time someone tried to bring Oz back, the story tends to repeat itself. Jon M was excited to dive in, but before anything else, he had to solve the same problem that derailed every earlier attempt: the rights. Since 1939, MGM had controlled much of The Wizard of Oz's most recognizable imagery. The ruby slippers, the exact shade of Elphaba's green skin, even specific bits of music and dialogue. One wrong move, and Universal could find itself facing a lawsuit worth millions. So the production spent months in negotiations with MGM's heirs and legal teams, trying to figure out what they could legally use and what had to be reinvented from scratch. It was a slow, meticulous, almost obsessive process, and it set the tone for the entire production. From day one, bringing Wicked back to life meant wrestling with something that, both legally and symbolically, just didn't want to return. Once the rights battle was finally over, it was time to cast the leads. And just like in Garland's era, the choice had to be flawless. The entire heart of Wicked rests on the relationship between Glinda and Elphaba. This time, the studio didn't think twice. Cynthia Erivo would play Elphaba, and Ariana Grande would be Glinda. The announcement blew up online. Debates, theories, fan wars, you name it. But by then, nothing was going to stop Oz from coming back. Filming officially began in 2022, with both chapters being filmed at the same time. It was an enormous undertaking. 2 scripts, 2 timelines, and 2 full production units running at maximum capacity. Jon M found himself facing a challenge even the old Hollywood titans never dared to try. But Oz has a way of fighting back. In 2023, the writers and actors' strike froze the entire industry. Wicked was one of the first major productions forced to shut down. Months passed before filming could resume. By then, the budget had skyrocketed, the schedule had shrunk, and the pressure from the studio was suffocating. Meanwhile, the rumors turned into part of the marketing without anyone meaning to. Leaked photos, supposed tensions, and whispers that the production felt cursed in the same way the 1939 film had been. And in the middle of all that noise, people kept bringing up Judy Garland's ghost. More than 80 years after The Wizard of Oz first hit theaters, history began repeating itself. 2 young women, massively talented and adored by millions, stepped into the same world that once consumed Judy Garland. The difference now? This time the entire world was watching in real time. During the Wicked production, social media turned into a second stage. Every appearance by Ariana or Cynthia was clipped, shared, slowed down, analyzed, and picked apart. And soon, fans, especially the most intense ones, started noticing changes in Ariana. A sharper jawline, a slimmer frame, and a quieter, more distant way of speaking. Some said it was just Glinda bleeding into real life. Others whispered about something more concerning. Ariana was playing the Good Witch, a character built around perfection, poise, and an everlasting smile. And to many, it looked like she'd taken that perfectionism far beyond the set. A handful of commentators even compared her behavior to full immersion acting, the kind where the performer never fully steps out of character. At the same time, rumors of tension between Ariana and Cynthia kept fueling headlines. Tabloids pushed stories about disagreements, on-set friction, ego clashes, even competition over vocal moments. None of it was confirmed, but the atmosphere was impossible to ignore. It was as if the press wanted, or needed, the 2 leads to become rivals, as though the curse of Oz always required a pair of witches at war. Behind the scenes, things kept getting worse. The final day of filming was supposed to be July 25, 2023, with the big "one short day" sequence. But 2 weeks before that, everything stopped. The actors' strike hit, and Wicked became one of its biggest casualties. Production shut down for nearly 4 months. Filming didn't resume until January 24, 2024, and it wrapped just 2 days later. In total, the filming stretched across 155 days, leaving behind a blown-out budget and a crew running on fumes. And as if that weren't enough, the set itself, so massive it showed up on aerial photos, seemed to turn against them. A series of unexpected rainstorms ruined parts of the outdoor build. The artificial grass of Oz began to rot, and the crew had to improvise a drainage system just to keep the place from flooding. No one said it out loud, but everyone was thinking it. Even the world they were trying to recreate didn't seem to want them there. Against every prediction, Wicked finally made it to the finish line. After years of delays, strikes, and rumor storms, Universal managed to complete both films, sealing Oz's return to the big screen. The final shots were filmed through tears, celebration, and a kind of heavy silence only the crew seemed to understand, as if everyone knew they'd survive something much bigger than a production schedule. On November 22, 2024, fantasy came back to life. For the first time in decades, Oz returned to the big screen, glowing with the promise of a new beginning. Gregory Maguire, the mind behind the novel, attended the premiere with a mix of relief and emotion. After years of delays, collapses, rewrites, and studio chaos, his version of the story had actually survived. He later said the film captured the blend of beauty, pain, and hope that Baum understood better than anyone. Inside theaters, the audience applauded. Some cried. For a moment, it seemed like the magic had finally worked again. But wait, did everyone forget we were talking about a franchise we've already proven is cursed? Because the marketing campaign tied to the release wasn't just ambitious. It turned into one of the most unexpected disasters in recent memory. And honestly, no meme kid, no marketing intern, no PR wizard on the planet could have predicted what happened next. Universal launched a massive global rollout. Clothes, cosmetics, books, accessories, the full machine. No problem there. The problem arrived thanks to the official Glinda and Elphaba dolls produced by Mattel. What should have been a flawless launch instantly collapsed into an international PR nightmare. The QR code on the box, meant to direct fans to wickedmovie.com, accidentally sent them to Wicked Pictures, an adult film company. Within hours, the mistake exploded on social media. One of the most expensive movies of the year was unintentionally promoting something we literally couldn't describe here unless we want the video removed from the platform. The PR damage was instant, and it wasn't the only problem on Universal's plate. The studio also came under fire for its marketing strategy, with many accusing it of intentionally hiding that Wicked was a musical. For months, every trailer focused on fantasy, spectacle, and large-scale visuals, but not a single moment of singing. Insiders claimed the executives were terrified of repeating the backlash that hit Joker 2, Folie à Deux, another expensive musical that critics ripped apart. Only a few weeks before the premiere, after non-stop confusion from audiences, Universal finally added small snippets of musical moments to the ads. And because chaos never comes alone, the controversy took a sharp turn into the religious arena. A conservative group in the US called 1 Million Moms announced a boycott, claiming the film promotes witchcraft and pushes an LGBTQ agenda. But instead of hurting Wicked, the boycott acted like free marketing. Within days, box office projections jumped from $165 to $200 million. Fans spread the word, excitement surged, and the movie's debut turned into a worldwide event. When the final numbers came in, nobody could believe it. Wicked had earned $756 million worldwide, blowing past every projection. Critics praised its visual ambition, the chemistry between Cynthia and Ariana, and the emotional punch at the center of the story. Kristin Chenoweth called it a work that honors everything Oz ever represented. Gregory Maguire said the film understood the soul of the novel. And then came the words that felt like the end of a century-long cycle. Lorna Luft, Judy Garland's daughter, and said, "It's extraordinary. Exactly the way Mom would have wanted it." For a moment, it looked like Oz had finally gotten the ending it was denied for so many decades. But the whispers didn't go away. Some claimed the on-set accidents, the storms that destroyed the set, the marketing disaster, and the non-stop online drama were too many coincidences for one production. Others argued that every bump along the way was a reminder of what Oz has always been, a world that didn't just welcome visitors, it changed them. After all these decades, Wicked didn't just bring a classic back to life, it did something even harder. It reconciled audiences with a story that always seemed destined for disaster. In November 2025, the second chapter, Wicked for Good, arrives with a new chance to tempt fate. Will this next release finally break the curse? If you've already seen part 2, tell me what you think in the comments. There are disturbing movies, and then there's Apt Pupil, Based on a story by Stephen King, it's about a teenager who blackmails a former Nazi officer.